good evening, everybody. We are back for our second leg of vasculitis update from IRA webinar series. Today, we have got Dr. URK Rao as our moderator. He was past president Indian Rheumatology Association, always a smiling face and very close friend of mine, deeply involved in IRA activities. Incidentally, due to some personal problems and family problem, Dr. John could not join with us. So we have uh, speakers Dr. Rao will introduce, but incidentally and unfortunately, Professor Louis Giloven could not join also with us due to personal commitments there. So may I request Dr. Rao to initiate the program. Thank you.
Good evening. Sunday evening, a pleasant one. We shall have three talks by eminent rheumatologist faculty, and then we can have a good discussion after each talk. The first talk would be on IgA vasculitis by Dr. Prajyoti Singh Mahapatra. He's a rheumatologist, consultant rheumatologist, IPGMER SSKM Hospital, Kolkata. So we used to call IgA vasculitis as Henoch-Schönlein purpura. Now, whether to treat or not to treat, he would decide and let us know. Thank you, Dr. Prajyut. Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I must thank Indian Rheumatology Association to give this opportunity to me to talk on this topic on this very important meeting. So IgA vasculitis, my talk today is to treat or not to treat. So at the very outset, my flow of talk would be what is the short and long-term outcome of IgA vasculitis? Can we predict a poor outcome? The clinical variables. My third would be, can we predict poor outcome with the histology help? And then about the drugs, whether corticosteroids, our good old friend, can prevent nephritis and other complications. And then the other poor outcome of nephritis, can it be prevented by corticosteroids and other therapies? And finally, I'll end up with the guidelines till date, which have been published, and a brief guideline on how to manage these patients and how to treat. So basically, the talk for today should be paraphrased as, should we treat IgA vasculitis more aggressively with immunosuppression or not, rather than simply putting it to treat or not to treat. Obviously, for a physician to say that I'm not going to treat, the situation is quite limited, only in the terminal end of life. But even then, it's not treating. So not treating is not an option. We should always treat any disease, and similarly for IgA vasculitis. Now, how should we treat? That's the important question. So why do we treat a disease? To relieve symptoms, to prevent complications, and finally, the aim should be to halt or reverse the disease course, rather a cure. Now, to begin, IgA vasculitis, formerly known as Henoch-Schönlein purpura, is a systemic small vessel leukocytoclastic vasculitis caused by deposition of IgA-containing immune complexes. Interestingly, this was described by another teacher-student duo, Henoch and Schönlein. Schönlein was basically the teacher, and Henoch, following his footsteps, described the manifestations, and finally it came out to be known as Henoch-Schönlein purpura, both from Germany. It's one of the most frequent systemic childhood vasculitis, with an annual incidence of 6.2 to 24 per lakh children. But in adults, it's not that common, roughly 1 in 1 lakh of adults. Now, only 2 or 3 slides on the classification criteria and the clinical manifestation before I delve into the topic proper, because otherwise the purpose of the second half of my talk would be defeated. Because which disease actually are we talking about? So as in many of the diseases in rheumatology, we will talk on the classification criteria. There are basically 2 classification criteria. One is the ACR classification criteria, which tells us that there must be palpable purpura, age less than 20, bowel angina, and wall granulocyte on biopsy. So presence of at least 2 criteria satisfies the diagnosis with a sensitivity of 87% and a specificity of again around 87%. While a newer criteria, which is the Euler-Pinto-Press classification criteria, it requires the presence of purpura, especially a lower limb purpura, to be absolute with a sensitivity of 100% and a specificity of 87%. So the purpura is mandatory in the Euler-Pinto-Press criteria. Now, to date, there is no established diagnostic criterion for IgA vasculitis. The ACR classification criteria have less utility in adults, and they do not differentiate well from other small vessel vasculitis. So that was a problem with the old ACR classification criteria. And this is important when we go for looking at the studies, because the earlier studies which classified patients on the basis of the ACR classification criteria might be a loose one, while the Euler criteria provide only for childhood IgA vasculitis, but obviously they are being used for adults as well. And few studies have looked at that. The presentation, apart from the other presentations, the most important presentation would be renal, and it's highly variable. The renal symptoms are rarely the first. 29% presents with renal symptoms within 1 month of onset, majority with mild renal signs like a hematuria or a minimal proteinuria. But a proteinuria of more than 1 gram per liter was detected in 3% patients, nephrotic syndrome in 2, hypertension in 3, and renal insufficiency in less than 1%. So basically, less than 3% or 5% of patients do have significant renal involvement to start with. The situation changes in adult life. So what about the long-term outcome? Why do we really need to treat? At the outset, the other manifestations of IgA vasculitis need to be treated. Like the arthritis, they are often treated with NSAIDs, as we will discuss later on. The purpura, that doesn't require any specific treatment. And the other sinister manifestations are more commonly localized to the gut and the kidneys. Gut is again not that common, but kidney, a long-term outcome is really important. The long-term outcome would be a chronic kidney disease in these IgA vasculitis nephritis or HSV nephritis patients. We must remember that we are dealing with IgA vasculitis nephritis and not IgA nephropathy, which the nephrologists per se look at. So in unselected population, the prevalence of CKD would be 1 to 2%, while most of the studies which are published from tertiary medical centers and especially the renal centers, they have CKD prevalence up to 20 to 30% by 20 years. This difference is because of the fact that only the severe disease present to the hospitals and the tertiary centers. So patients with severe initial symptoms are obviously at higher risk. However, there are some problems in there as well. There is absence of correlation between the initial presentation and long-term renal outcome. There is possible occurrence of spontaneous remission in patients with severe presentation, and the other way around, possible evolution to end-stage renal disease in patients with mild symptoms. So it becomes quite unpredictable at times. Let's look at a few of the studies which have discussed the poor prognostic situations. So this was from 2002, published in Journal of American Society of Nephrology by Pilbot et al. It was a retrospective study with a median follow-up of quite long 15 years of 250 patients, adult patients, I mean 16 years and more, who were suffering from HSV nephritis. So the diagnosis was predominant mesangial IgA immune deposits on renal biopsy. This was mandatory to be included in the study, and the patients suffering from IgA nephropathy without systemic signs were excluded. So any patient who were quite mild were excluded. So let's look at the baseline renal data. The renal function was normal in roughly 67 to 68% patients. There were moderate impairment and severe impairment in 1/3 of the patients. Proteinuria, again, 0.1 to 1 gram in 25% and 1 to 3 gram in roughly 40%, and nephrotic range proteinuria in around 30% of patients. So what after the long-term follow-up? If we look at the analysis which were done, looking at the survival curve, so it happened that the patient survival was only 74% after the follow-up of 14 to 15 years. Regarding renal function, 11% of patients reached end-stage renal failure, 13% had severe renal failure with a creatinine clearance of less than 30, and 14% had moderate renal insufficiency, which means that the outcome was not good. Uh, in fact, the prospective studies or the retrospective studies which looked at long-term outcome, they quite differ. But all the long-term studies which were quite long enough, they had such kind of poor outcome. In the patients, cancer was a leading cause of mortality in around 30%, 27% of patients. This frequency was higher than the general population. So what were the significant prognostic factors for the severe renal failure in this study? So they did a multivariate analysis, and it was seen that creatinine and proteinuria levels at the time of renal biopsy and the proportions of interstitial fibrosis, glomerular fibrinoid necrosis, glomerular sclerosis. So they were found to be independent risk factors for severe renal failure. It's of note that this study and that of Fogazi et al. Are the only ones which have a long-term follow-up. This may explain the even poorer renal prognosis reported by these authors rather than some of the other studies. So if we summarize, what are the factors associated with poor renal outcome? The baseline renal function impairment, baseline proteinuria, macroscopic hematuria, hypertension, proteinuria more than 1 gram, and on renal biopsy, presence of crescents, degree of interstitial fibrosis, sclerotic glomeruli, and fibrinoid necrosis. So again, can we predict the poor outcome? Because now, by now, we know that the outcome is not good, especially in adults. So we need to treat. Now, can we predict? Because we know there is a lot of variables involved in this, and treating those patients who can spontaneously resolve with immunosuppression does more harm than good. So this was a study. This was a meta-analysis with nine studies basically. So these were on children with IgA vasculitis nephritis or the HSV nephritis, the same thing. So what they did, so looking at this, so the risk factors they found were age. So more the age, poorer the prognosis, lower the GFR. The red ones are, I've highlighted in the red ones are the poor prognosis, so low GFR, presence of nephrotic syndrome, nephritic nephrotic syndrome, and the ISKDC kidney biopsy stage of 3 to 5, so 3, 4, or 5. So they were poor prognostic factors. Interestingly, presence of hematuria and mild proteinuria with hematuria were not prognostically worse. Looking at another study, that was a children one, looking at the adults, can we predict again the poor outcome? So it was a prospective study which included histologically proven adult IgA vasculitis nephritis diagnosed between 2013 and 19. So this was a recent one from Slovenia. There were 214 new IgV cases, and the follow-up was around 60 to 80 months. So the organ involvement, if we go above the age, so going to the adult population and the elderly, the prevalence of the GI involvement and renal involvement rises. So what they also found in the multivariate logistic regression is that severe IgA vasculitis nephritis or severe GI involvement in IgA vasculitis, or renal involvement of any type, generalized purpura, and female gender, they were factors associated with immunomodulatory therapy besides glucocorticoids. So what they basically tried to mean is that female gender with a generalized purpura with either a GI involvement or a renal involvement, they required more of immunosuppression, meaning thereby they were more serious disease. So could it be predicted? So they found age, active smoking, generalized purpura, elevated serum IgA, and a neutrophil lymphocyte ratio of more than 3.5. They were prognostically important for renal involvement. And of them, the purpura, elevated IgA, and NLR more than 3.5 were again important for GI involvement. What about elderly? So we looked at children, we looked at adult. What about the elderly? the distinct this was done on 106 adult patients of 19 to 64 years and 46 elderly who were 65 plus. The results are rates of hypertension, impaired renal function, hypoalbuminemia, and crescentic glomerulonephritis were significantly higher among the elderly. So the prognosis is even worse in the elderly. In another study, uh, it was seen that only 49% achieved complete remission, and ongoing renal disease was the most common persistent organ manifestation, but extrarenal activity was also present in more than 50% of patients who were not achieving complete remission, and 43% had relapsing disease. So if we look at some of the other studies in a single slide, we can find that there is significantly 10 to 15% of adults had significant renal impairment. So if we look at the right panel of renal outcome and the studies on the left panel dating back to 1997 to 2006, so we can see that the renal impairment is around 10 to 15% in most of the studies, at least severe and moderate. While in a recent study in 2006, the clinical remission was found in 43%, ESRD in 27%, and renal insufficiency in 8%. This may be a little biased because of again, the tertiary referral thing. My third question was, can histology help in deciding therapy? So we looked at the clinical and biochemical parameters which can predict a poor renal outcome. Now, looking at the histology, we know renal histology is quite good. Like in lupus, all our treatment is directed looking at the histology. So HSP nephritis or IgAVN has an acute, although extremely variable presentation, from minimal microscopic hematuria to rapidly progressing renal failure. Thus, attempts have been made to predict it. There are two forms of histologic classification. The established one is ISKDC, which is the typical classification which is done for the IgA vasculitis nephritis. It looks at mostly the crescents, but the problems are that ISKDC takes into account mainly the acute lesions. It does not include morphologic lesions like interstitial and glomerular inflammation, tubular atrophy, interstitial fibrosis, segmental sclerosis, or the vascular lesions. The extracapillary proliferation is a dominant histologic feature of HSPN, extremely variable upon timing of biopsy. So when we are doing the biopsy is again important. We might see a not so severe histologic picture if we do the biopsy early before the onset of the renal involvement, and that can create problem. So another classification criteria which was used it was the Oxford MESTC classification. This was not for the HSP nephritis. This was for IgA nephropathy without any systemic involvement. This was a good one. It looked at the mesangial score, the endocapillary hypercellularity, the segmental glomerulosclerosis, the tubular atrophy, and the crescents. So this was basically a all pervasive classification of histology. But the using it has been validated in IgA nephropathy. Now, several studies in recent years have attempted to extend the Oxford MEST classification to selected cohorts of HSPN in adults and also in children, and it can help us in deciding the therapy. So if we know that at least a significant percentage of patients of IgA vasculitis nephritis do have poor prognosis, is there anything to do to prevent the IgA vasculitis nephritis? Yes, several schemes of preemptive treatment, mainly based on short-term oral corticosteroids, have been employed, but without a significantly positive effect in avoiding nephritis occurrence. So the recommendation was not to use corticosteroids to prevent the IgA vasculitis nephritis. So not in preventing nephritis. Now, once the nephritis occurs, should it be steroids or non-steroids? Again, the evidence is not so clear, and one of the meta-analysis or the Cochrane database finally commented, further adequately powered RCTs of short-term prednisolone therapy compared with placebo should be considered in children who develop kidney disease with HSP or have risk factors of developing kidney disease. And the recommendation was from KDIGO that children with persistent proteinuria below 1 gram are treated with ACE or ARBs for at least 6 months. Even if the proteinuria is increasing along the time, still treat them for 6 months with ACE ARB. In the event of a persistent proteinuria, it was suggested that these children may be treated with a 6 month course of steroid as in IgA nephropathy. But this was hotly debated, especially in the European countries. Why? Because in many of these children, we have seen from earlier studies that they develop a poor renal outcome. So just treating them for 6 months without any immunosuppression was thought to be injudicious. Now, immunosuppressive agents in IgA vasculitis nephritis, when? Now, the conclusive data, the second drug, which is our good old cyclophosphamide used in many of the significant nephritis in rheumatology like lupus and vasculitis, on cyclophosphamide efficacy on the survival of renal function is not available. In children, a randomized controlled trial was not conclusive of long-term protection similar to adults. Yes, the trial although showed that the proteinuria reduced, but then the long-term outcome was not changed. The practice point being rapidly progressing cases with persistent steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome or with more than 50% crescents, immunosuppression is widely used, including cyclosporin, tacrolimus, mycophenolate, and rarely rituximab. Looking at the immunosuppression studies in adult IgA vasculitis nephritis, I have purposefully left out the studies prior to 2010 because not many drugs were available. So starting from 2010 till 2017, we have seen studies with corticosteroids alone, corticosteroids with cyclophosphamide, mycophenolate, colchicine, rituximab. The most important drug would possibly be mycophenolate because of the low toxicity profile, especially in children and young adults. So in a study by Han et al. In 2015, which was a retrospective one, done with almost 100 patients, roughly 1/3 in each of the arm with mycophenolate and low dose corticosteroid, standard dose corticosteroid, and the control or placebo group. So it was seen that 73% and 71% of the mycophenolate group responded, contrary to 48% in control group. So mycophenolate at 6 months did well. Regarding rituximab, there are few trials only, and this is recent one. So what does the guideline state? Coming to the guideline, the KDIGO guideline, prevention of nephritis, the first statement was, actually the KDIGO guidelines are more concerned with IgA nephropathy and not IgA vasculitis nephritis, maybe because of the association's kinness to nephrology. So the first point was prevention of nephritis in IgA vasculitis. The recommendation was, we recommend not using corticosteroids to prevent nephritis. These patients, the cardiovascular risk should be assessed, appropriate intervention should be given, and treat to nationally agreed BP targets, and RAS inhibition should be the maximal if the proteinuria is high. Patients with IgA vasculitis with associated nephritis were at high risk of progressive CKD despite supportive care. So the practice point was insufficient evidence to support the use of the histologic Oxford score in determining whether immunosuppression should be commenced, which I dealt with earlier, and the presence of crescents in kidney biopsy also by itself not an indication for immunosuppression. However, if immunosuppression is being considered, discuss the risk and benefit with the patient and the likely problems that the patient can have, especially in a reduced renal function. Finally, with RPGN, yes, the risk benefit should be discussed, but the patients who are agreeing to treatment, they should be treated with cyclophosphamide and corticosteroid in accordance with the guidelines for ANCA-associated vasculitis, because this is an RPGN and we can lose the patient or lose the kidneys in any time. Finally, the last guideline and the recent guideline is the European or the SHARE initiative guideline. I'll deal in only 4 slides, my concluding slides. So analgesia, yes, this was what I was referring to as symptom relief. Our first goal of treatment in any disease. Adequate analgesia should be prescribed for IgA vasculitis associated arthropathy. Remember to give adequate fluid intake to prevent renal dysfunction. Adequate analgesia should also be given in IgA vasculitis associated abdominal pain, but an ultrasound is more often required to see whether there is intussusception or not, or there is GI bleed or not. In that case, appropriate protection measures should be taken. Use of corticosteroids, yes, corticosteroids are indicated in orchitis, cerebral vasculitis, pulmonary hemorrhage, and other severe organ or life-threatening manifestations, including nephritis. In patients with severe abdominal pain or rectal bleeding, in whom intussusception has been excluded with an ultrasonography, corticosteroid treatment could be considered. The dose 1 to 2 milligram per kg per day. A pulse methylprednisolone may be of more benefit. Some people have dealt with a Locatelli regime, which is basically methylprednisolone intravenously on alternate month for 3 days. Prophylactic corticosteroid treatment to prevent nephritis is not indicated. In nephritis, the treatment is ACE inhibitor should be considered to limit secondary glomerular injury for patients with persistent proteinuria. In mild renal dysfunction, oral prednisolone, azathioprine, mycophenolate, and/or pulse methylprednisolone can be used, but this should be done after doing a biopsy because the picture would change. For moderate, oral prednisolone and/or pulsed methylprednisolone, mycophenolate, or IV cyclophosphamide may be used in first or second line treatment. Cyclosporin and oral cyclophosphamide cannot be routinely recommended. For severe disease, yes, same as ANCA-associated vasculitis, cyclophosphamide with pulse methylprednisolone. For maintenance, they have given the option for azathioprine or mycophenolate. So I'll skip this skin and GI. This is quite well known. And in a single slide, if we look at the IgA vasculitis nephritis, so these patients are basically classified as mild, moderate, and severe. Mild is normal GFR, moderate is less than 50% crescent, severe is more than 50% crescent, and persistent proteinuria as the left-hand panel I have given. So for mild nephritis, the first line would be oral prednisolone. For moderate, oral prednisolone and/or pulsed methylprednisolone. Severe, first line is IV cyclophosphamide with pulse methylprednisolone, as I already told, as it is for ANCA-associated vasculitis. For second line, we can use mycophenolate, or pulse methylprednisolone. In moderate to severe disease, we can use cyclophosphamide for this group. So to summarize, gastrointestinal and renal involvement represents the principal causes of mortality and morbidity, especially.
Just looking at the questionnaire, very nice. Dr. Prashant, you are finished. The next speaker is Dr. Professor Rajeshwari, consultant rheumatologist, and she is HOD rheumatology, Sri Ramachandra Medical College, Chennai. Professor Rajeshwari, please. This is on the update on Behçet syndrome or Behçet's disease. Professor Rajeshwari.
Good evening, one and all. It's my bound duty to first thank the Association of the Indian Rheumatology Association, the President, Secretary, and all the others who have given me this opportunity to talk on this very difficult, heterogeneous, volatile, difficult to understand type of vasculitis, the Behçet syndrome, Behçet disease, or Behçet, whatever you want to call it. And I thank Professor URK Rao for introducing me with his kind words. Now, what lies ahead? I cannot go into detail about all those I've mentioned in this slide. I will just give you some highlights and tidbits. One, for fear of overstepping the time. And secondly, that all of you will run away if I go into deep into the pathogenesis of this difficult vasculitis. So without knowing the updates on etiology and pathogenesis, it's difficult to proceed to the treatment and the latest updates on management. So genetic influences, all of us know that HLA-B51 has always played a major role in Behçet disease. It's associated with some of the manifestations, but not all. Non-HLA genes also have been found to play a role. And now we have the presence of altered host bacteria or the bacterial response, and then altered hematopoietic cells and the cytokines, presence of immune complexes and autoantibodies. And as you know, every vasculitis has an element of vascular endothelial activation and hypercoagulability associated with or without thrombus. And we have the epigenetic alterations, which are the latest updates. Now, apart from HLA-B51, the presence of MYC-A6 allele, which has been stipulated to be involved in IBD, the presence of it has increased the susceptibility to Behçet, and the presence of HAP10 association which is a low activity variant of IRAP1, that is endothelial reticulum aminopeptidase 1, and the presence of IRAP1 gene polymorphisms, which make it similar to stimulates spondyloarthropathies. Now, the non-HLA gene polymorphisms include ICAM1, TNF-alpha, and VEGF to a certain extent, along with IL-10 and IL-23. Molecular mimicry is a universal postulated reason in almost any type of disease, autoimmune disease today. Here, the self-heat shock protein interacts with the mycobacterial HSP, and ASO titers have been increased for a long time. We all know about this for years together. And again, this has been verified with the presence of Streptococcus sanguine with high antibody titers to this Streptococcus. And now the present trend is altered gut microbiome. This is especially for the postgraduates. Whenever you don't know the pathogenesis of any disease, you're justified in writing altered gut microbiome and the presence of netosis. So what does this altered gut microbiome do? It is due to the paucity of Roseburia and subdolic granulum, low butyrate production, abundance of bifidobacterium, and mutations in the fucosal transferase 2. And again here, because the vasculature is involved, you have the endothelial antigen, which cross-reacts with the H. pylori cytotoxin antibody. Innate immunity has been known to play a role here with the mannose binding lectin, which is reduced or undergoes mutation, presence of increased TLR 2 and 4 activity, and as I said, the netosis. Immune complexes also play a role. Antibodies have been found against the oral mucosal antigen, the endothelial cells, the killer immunoglobulin receptors, the CTLA4, kinectin, ASCA, etc. Behçet uveitis, one of the dreaded complications or manifestations of Behçet. Here, autoimmunity has been found against the most privileged retinal-S antigen, which all of us know. And here, there are more antigens like alpha-tropomyosin, selenium binding protein, and the interphotoreceptor retinoid binding protein, the IRBP. Now, epigenetic alterations are the latest, and they have found there is a differential methylation of genes, especially associated with the cytoskeletal remodeling and cell adhesion in CD4 T cells. And the effects of microRNA 155 expression on the Th17 cells. I won't bore you with more theory. We will go into this colorful picture. As I already mentioned, you have the genetic susceptibility, the HLA and the non-HLA, which along with the triggering factors like bacteria or virus, along with all the other mechanisms I have mentioned, they join together and they stimulate the innate immune cells. These innate immune cells, in their turn, they stimulate the antigen-presenting cells, which stimulate the autoimmune T cells. And the innate immune cells also stimulate the gamma delta cells and the natural killer cells, which join together and produce the pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-1, 6, TNF-alpha, interferon gamma, IL-12, 23, TGF-beta, and they are responsible for the tissue damage and the inflammatory lesions. Natural killer cells, again, by themselves, produce tissue damage, inflammatory lesions. Activation of the neutrophils produces hyperactivation of the neutrophil and thereby finally predisposing to thrombus and endothelial dysfunction and vasculitis. So in summary, you have the autoimmune T cells, the tissue damage by inflammatory lesions, and thrombosis, endothelial dysfunction, and vasculitis, which are just a few of the manifestations. Here again is another chart which shows again, when genetically predisposed host, the CD4 naive cell is activated, which reacts with the antigen-presenting cell, producing the pro-inflammatory cytokines. And the activated CD4 cell, again, it upregulates the TH1 cells, the TH17 and TH22, which again are responsible for the inflammatory lesions, the inflammatory autoimmune lesions, the mucocutaneous lesions, respectively. However, T regulatory cells are downregulated, hence there's a decreased immunosuppressive effect. I hope this is quite simple. And every vasculitis, as I told you, always has an endothelial dysfunction. Now, what happens to the endothelium in Behçet? There is decreased flow mediated dilatation. There is increased homocysteine. All of us know it's a disease activity marker and predisposes to thrombosis. There is increased VEGF. There is increased endothelin 1 and the ADMA or the asymmetric dimethyl arginine and anti-endothelial cell antibodies. Increased triglycerides also play a role. Apart from that, other contributors belong to the prothrombotic profile states. We would not be complete in understanding Behçet if you don't know a little bit about the pathology. I thought this should have been mentioned yesterday, but I will just mention a few bits about this. It is a purely thrombotic leukocytoclastic vasculitis in the small vessels, and thrombosis occurs almost in all the vessels wherever you do the biopsy. Mucocutaneous and papillopustular lesions simulate SLE with the immune complex deposition and liquefactive generation in the mucocutaneous lesions at the dermoepidermal junction, and in the pustular lesions are not sterile. They demonstrate Staph aureus and Privitella. EN lesions, we all know it's paniculatus. It may be mixed, lobular, or septal. Coming to the mucocutaneous, we all know pseudofolliculitis, acne, oral genital ulcers, pyoderma are all associated with Behçet. Now, what does this EULAR 2018 say about the mucocutaneous involvement? See, as a rule, topical steroids play a major role wherever it is needed. Similarly, lesional steroids also play a role wherever it's needed. And in refractory cases, systemic steroids are employed. So this forms a base for treatment with other drugs, which should be used in combination as and when necessary. And invariably, immunosuppressives take a role, big role. Only steroids should not be employed for the treatment. Colchicine is tried as a first line of treatment, we know, for the dominant lesion, especially EN or genital ulcer. And drugs like AZA, thalidomide, interferon alpha, TNF inhibitors, or apremilast should be considered in selected cases. Now, this is a 2018 NEJM article on role of apremilast in the oral ulcers in Behçet syndrome. However, when you see the dose used here is 30 milligram twice a day, which I doubt whether it would suit the Indian population because of the side effects. Coming to one of the most dreaded manifestations and complications of Behçet is the eye involvement. We know anterior, posterior, intermediate, or pan-uveitis can occur in Behçet, and usually can be bilateral. Similarly, retina also can be involved. You have arterial occlusion, retinal necrosis, retinal vasculitis, and blindness can result. This is one of the newer modalities. All of us know about it. It's the OCT, which shows the whole retina being avulsed from the choroid. In cases of doubt, whether it's macular edema or retinal detachment, this procedure can be done. What does 2018 EULAR recommendations say for eye? As I said, on a background of steroid cycloplegics, use azathioprine, cyclosporin, interferon alpha, monoclonal anti-TNF, and systemic steroids in combination with immunosuppressives. Intravitreal glucocorticoids can be tried. What do you do when you have isolated anterior uveitis? Systemic immunosuppressives could be considered for those with poor prognostic factors like young age, male sex, and an early disease onset. Now, coming to certain updates after the EULAR guidelines. See, mycophenolate mofetil has been an underestimated drug. Actually, it's quite useful in many of the manifestations of many of the diseases. So it's only given in few articles. But with personal experience, I would say as a remission-inducing agent, MMF can be used apart from AZA, cyclosporin, and tacrolimus has been found to play a good role, IV cyclo, and TNF inhibitors. For retinal vasculitis, again, interferon, PEG interferon have been tried. Other newer updates on new drugs, tocilizumab has been found to be useful for refractory uveitis macular edema, anakinra canakinumab for uveitis retinal vasculitis, rituximab for refractory macular edema, tofacitinib, baricitinib for refractory macular edema and ocular inflammation, ustekinumab trials are ongoing, alemtuzumab, anti-CD52, again, it's been found to be useful. However, this IL-17 and daclizumab have not been found to be useful in any way, though TH17 has been implicated. Coming to the next difficult problem, NeuroBeche. See, NeuroBeche, see, it was SLE, it was syphilis initially, then it became SLE, then it became HIV, then it became COVID, but nobody spoke about NeuroBeche and Beche and its varied manifestations or protein manifestations. So any part of the nervous system can be involved. Vasculitis or vasculopathy can occur, or both can occur together. And IL-17, IL-6, TNF-alpha, interferon have been implicated in the vasculitis component as far as the vascular component of the nervous system is concerned. Now you have parenchymal, non-parenchymal involvement, and a mixed parenchymal and non-parenchymal involvement also can occur. When in the parenchymal, the brainstem and the spinal, the cervicothoracic region are very midbrain, brainstem, the cervicothoracic areas are commonly involved. And as all of us know, arterial and venous thrombi occur, aneurysms can occur, dissection can occur, intracranial hypertension also is one of the common manifestations. This is an MRI T2 image showing the midbrain thalamus involvement, the mesodiencephalic lesions called as the cascade sign, which is very, very characteristic of Beche. And in the second picture, you see multiple T2 flared hyperintense lesions in the subcortical deep and periventricular matter. Coming to the cervicothoracic region, where the arterial lesions are predominant, as we said, and ischemia to the anterior spinal artery can result in the central, as you see in the pictures, there's a central hypodense area with a peripheral hyperdense ring. This is called as a Bagel sign, and this is very, very characteristic of Beche. This again, the first picture shows territorial arterial ischemic infarcts, and the second picture is an MRI of the spinal cord in the cervical region showing multiple segmental hyperdense areas in the center, which can indicate either infarct or demyelination. This is a classical, on the left side, you see one picture above and below, classical pictures of Beche, the above one showing the transverse sinus thrombus and the below one showing the arterial infarct, and the one on the right-hand side showing the transverse sinus thrombus and a superior sagittal sinus thrombus. When it manifests as a meningoencephalitis, how do you differentiate it from multiple sclerosis, which is the commonest differential diagnosis? They have found increased IL-6 levels, IL-10 levels, neutrophils, and sugar. Facial palsy, not found in multiple sclerosis, is a characteristic feature of Beche. What does EULAR 2018 say? Again, as in difficult organs, aggressive manifestations, aggressive treatment has to be employed, and in parenchymal high-dose steroids, and azathioprine has been a universal drug. It was in those yesteryears, it's still a good drug. So hence aza is mentioned in almost all the immunosuppressive drugs. However, in CNS manifestations, cyclosporin should be avoided. All of us know why, because of the seizure potential. TNF blockers have been employed as a first line. They are very good drugs for CNS. Venous thrombosis can be treated with high-dose steroids, immunosuppressives. Anticoagulants can be used on a short-term basis. What else are the newer drugs? Tocilizumab, rituximab case reports, anakinra, canakinumab, and IVIG in refractory cases. Of course, MMF is there for remission. Coming to the gastrointestinal, a very hidden area of Beche, not very well worked out. And it simulates Crohn's disease. So what are the differential differentiating factors between Crohn's and Beche, intestinal Beche? As in Crohn's, you get anal fissure, fistula, and Crohn's, which is very rare in Beche. Ulcers are found in both, but here in Beche, it's a characteristic round or oval shaped volcano type of ulcer. Treatment here is with 5-ASA, steroids, azathioprine, and biologics, the TNF inhibitors. The first one is a Crohn's ulcer, and the second one is a volcano Beche ulcer. Now, what is this MHC1-opathy? It's very important for students as a theory question. And we know for years together that Beche and spondyloarthropathy simulate each other. There are a lot of similarities between both. Certain new insights have been found as to why both should have similar features. So the first one is the presence of IL-10, 23, and 17. Both are implicated in Beche and SPA. Enthesitis is a common feature in SPA and Beche, and both are secondary to microtrauma or increased pressure. HLA-B51 is epistatic to ERAP1. So that means when ERAP1 is present and predisposes to ankylosing spondylitis, it protects against Behçet in HLA-B51 individuals. That is the explanation for this. Pathogy versus Kubner's, both are secondary to skin trauma. Enthesitis and eye involvement are found in both. Behçet and SPA have elements of both innate and adaptive pathways. What did the EULAR recommendation say? After diagnosing and ruling out infections, in case of emergency like perforation, bleeding, or obstruction, surgery is the treatment of choice. But see that you have to do it when immunosuppressive treatment is given along with steroids and immunosuppressives as far as possible, unless it's an emergency when you have to add on that also. And the drugs used again here are 5-ASA, azathioprine, TNF, blockers, thalidomide. Newer drugs like interferon alpha, IVIG, stem cell transplant has been used for complete remission, and anakinra, canakinumab, we need more evidence, likewise for tocilizumab. Coming to our real vasculitis, vascular Behçet. We know that it produces both arterial and venous thrombosis as well as aneurysms. One peculiarity here is that the thrombus is grossly inflammatory and adherent, hence embolization is not very common except in the pulmonary vasculature. Old wine in a new bottle. This is a report of 2010, which I don't think many of us are aware. So I just picked it up in the updates just to make us aware of what is happening in the nail fold capillaroscopy, which shows capillary dystrophies, sludging, petechiae, pericapillary edema, and in the conjunctival vessels, microaneurysms, coiling, and kinking of vessels have been found. It was something new to me. I thought I'll share it with you. And this first picture shows a common femoral vein thrombosis, and the second one shows an ulnar artery aneurysm. Remember, as I said, younger age of onset, males, and with aneurysms, they don't carry a very good prognosis unless you treat them aggressively. What did the EULAR recommendation say? For acute deep vein thrombosis, steroids, immunosuppressives are a must, as are cyclophosphamide, cyclosporin. For refractory, biologics, TNF inhibitors, anticoagulants can be tried, but in the presence of pulmonary artery aneurysms, beware of anticoagulants because they may bleed. For arterial involvement, cyclophosphamide, TNF inhibitors, and wherever necessary, embolization should be preferred to endoscope to open surgery. For aneurysms, cyclophosphamide, steroids, and stenting can be done wherever necessary. Newer drugs, alemtuzumab, anti-CD52, for refractory and relapsing cases. For pulmonary artery aneurysm, pulse steroid cyclo should be given, and then only endoscopic surgery should be undertaken. Embolization can be done in refractory cases, lobectomy can be done, pulmonary endarterectomy can be done. For cerebral aneurysm, all of us know surgical clipping, and for intracardiac thrombus or endomyocardial fibrosis, surgical removal. Now, many of you may ask, aren't there any simpler drugs, oral drugs, tablets, anything new, anything upfront for the treatment? And all of us know about the JAK inhibitors, and all of us know that tofacitinib has become very, very affordable now. So this is a pilot study of tofacitinib published in Annals of Rheumatic Diseases, May 2020, for refractory Behçet syndrome. The red color in the bar diagram indicates the vascular, the yellow one, the articular, and the blue one is the intestinal. So obviously, vascular Behçet showed a lot of improvement with tofacitinib. Articular showed medium improvement, whereas intestinal did not improve at all. Now summarizing the updated treatments for Behçet based on the immune responses. We have the innate immune response and the drugs acting on the innate immune response and the cytokines, the TNF antagonists, IL-1 blocker anakinra, IL-6 blocker tocilizumab, IL-12/23 antagonist ustekinumab, still under trial, interferon alpha. For the adaptive immune response, acting on Th1 cells, we have the TNF antagonists and interferon alpha. Acting on the Th17 cells, the TNF antagonists, infliximab, adalimumab, IL-17 blocker, secukinumab. Remember, secukinumab doesn't come anywhere in the picture. Hence, strong points in favor of Behçet are the presence of oral ulcers, absence of them literally rules out Behçet, eye disease with its characteristic manifestations, genital ulceration with the scars, the major vessel involvement, the presence of pulmonary artery aneurysms is absolutely or almost diagnostic of Behçet, parenchymal neurological disease with its classical manifestations, as I told you. And now we have certain disease, distinct disease subsets. There is a vascular disease with acne, with arthritis and enthesitis clusters. They are two important subsets. And though it's a weak marker for Behçet, along with the MHC vanopathies, we should always implicate the presence of Behçet in them. This is from Nature 2018. Now to summarize, because of want of time, I didn't go into the criteria, and the latest criteria 2014 international criteria for Behçet has included almost all that I have discussed, especially the oral genital ulcers, the vascular involvement, arterial, venous, the skin involvement, the genital involvement, and neurological involvement, but it is forgotten to mention the intestinal involvement. Why should intestine alone suffer? Could it not be included? Let's think about it, because it has a different pathogenesis. And again, in conclusion, what was present in the early years, again, it has been reiterated with all the updates that Behçet is a heterogeneous disease, both in pathogenesis and presentation. It presents with remissions and exacerbations. Multiple organ systems are involved with varying manifestations at different points of times, with waxing and waning. Sometimes it can go into complete remission with treatment, and they can be asymptomatic for years together. And different drugs are needed for different manifestations. And today, being the biologic era and the JAK inhibitor era, and maybe newer drugs will come into vogue with the fast developing industries trying to compete with one another. Definitely more drugs will be there in the pipeline, and new upfront drugs are there for us. Thank you for your patient listening. This picture I just wanted to show. The ancient Silk Road was, the journey was very cumbersome, and it took a long time for them to reach from China to Greece and Turkey. And the travel was by camels. Though it was adventurous, it was cumbersome and took a lot of delay. However, in the present era, what with all the new modalities of transport and industries competing with each other, and we being aware of all the newer updates, things should be much faster. Didn't we work up COVID during the last 1 year quickly? Similarly, so the past may be appalling, but the future appears promising for Behçet, I assure you. Thank you for your patient listening. I will take questions for which I think I can give answers. The rest I would request all of you to read up, just like me. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Rajeshwari. Dr. Prajit Singh Mahapatra, can you mention succinct answers for every question? The role of IgA level.
Yeah, although I have shown in one of the studies that they have measured the IgA level, and they have shown that IgA level do predict poor prognostic outcome, but this is not standard, and so it should not be done in clinical practice.
Dr. Soumya Jain and Dr. Lalit Duggal want to know the role of Dapsone in the management of IgA vasculitis in severe form or minor.
Yeah, Dapsone is mostly used for the cutaneous manifestations of IgA vasculitis. They have been tried in case series from quite some time. Also, there are one or two reports of use in abdominal symptoms as well. But regarding the more serious manifestations like renal and GI vasculitis, they have practically no role.
Dr. Prashant wants to know, do you think the percentage of presence in the renal biopsy, they help in deciding the immunosuppressive therapy?
In histopathology, what subset may require immunosuppression?
Percentage of the crescents.
Oh yes, classically it is said more than 50% of crescents, but it's not absolute. I mean, in the 2012 KDIGO guideline, they have reduced the percentage of crescents. So, and by now we know it's not just the crescents. Even some of the adult patients who don't have crescents, they can go on to develop CKD in long-term follow-up. But ideally, yes, more than 50%.
Okay, that's good. How to classify mild to moderate or severe disease of renal involvement?
I've already shown in
You
my
already told,
slides.
yes, yes.
Yeah, I've already shown in my slides that it's creatinine clearance and the proteinuria. So mild disease would be normal GFR, moderate disease would be creatinine clearance less than 50, and severe disease creatinine clearance less than 30. Otherwise, we can also go by the proteinuria. So this I already showed in the Share Initiative guideline, which they have given.
Right. Dr. Arvind wants to know the association of the HSP with the Sjogren syndrome. How common it is?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Yeah. Though it was, I don't know whether in the etiology of Sjogren's whether HSP was mentioned. I'm not sure. Just it's a vague vasculature. The role of tacrolimus, Dr. Manisha wants to know.
Yeah, tacrolimus can be used. Tacrolimus, I already showed that along with azathioprine, tacrolimus also is one of the drugs which can be used in moderate IgA vasculitis nephritis, and also in maintenance we can use.
Yeah.
So tacrolimus is used in moderate IgA vasculitis nephritis.
Okay, then if serum IgA is raised, can we avoid biopsy to label the disease as HSP? Dr. Prajot.
No, sir. But IgA vasculitis is.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult question actually. Then how long should we give immunosuppressive therapy to IgA glomerulonephritis? I think you also have shown this.
Yeah.
How long should we give immunosuppressive therapy?
Yes, I've already shown that in most of the situations it's a short-term immunosuppression, but there are no good RCTs available to show the long-term results. So most of the time it's a short-term, and especially corticosteroids for 6 months at the most.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahapatra. Now, can I see Dr. Rajeshwari? Can we have questions for you?
Yes, sir.
Can Behçet's cause leukopenia and MAS? That's a macrophage activation syndrome. Dr. Shanmuganandam wants to know.
Shanmugam, thank you for that most difficult question. First is our experience with Behçet disease has not been that much like SLE and AOSD and systemic arthritis. So far, to my knowledge, with my limited experience, we have not seen macrophage activation syndrome and leukopenia with Behçet. But as far as logic is concerned and logistically, if the disease is going to be aggressive with multi-system manifestations, aggressive multi-system manifestations, it should occur, isn't it? I don't know. This is just logistic reasoning, that is all.
So he also wants to know, can Behçet's present only with abdominal pain, bilateral sacroiliitis, without oral ulcers, without genital ulcers, or without uveitis? That's abdominal pain aside. I think it's like a spondyloarthritis.
Of course, yes. As I already mentioned, Behçet was initially grouped in our days when we studied in the old textbooks, especially McCarthy and other books used to describe Behçet. It used to be classified under the subgroup of spondyloarthropathies, like an undifferentiated spondyloarthropathy. But now, as I already said, the ERAP1 and the B51 and B27 associations and the occurrence together and the epistatic effect of ERAP1 can suppress the manifestation of Behçet, and they can present just like spondyloarthritis. Of course, yes, like an inflammatory bowel disease and a spondyloarthropathy, sacroiliitis picture can occur in Behçet.
Thank you. Dr. Prashant wants to know when to use anticoagulation in Behçet's disease. And Dr. Soumya Jain wants to know the role of new anticoagulants. Can we club them?
Okay, as anticoagulation, as I said, whenever there is a thrombus, especially a venous thrombus, is a real indication for anticoagulants. But remember, anticoagulation is the only sole therapy for management of thrombotic manifestations, is not at all ideal and is contraindicated. It has to be given in combination with immunosuppressives like steroids and other immunosuppressives, which I mentioned. But anticoagulation is relatively or maybe even absolutely contraindicated when pulmonary artery aneurysm is there, for the only fear of it bleeding to a huge extent. Hence, whenever you want to treat pulmonary artery aneurysm, you either treat them previously, when you diagnose it early enough, you treat them previously with immunosuppressives and steroids, and it's better to avoid anticoagulants in patients with pulmonary artery aneurysm. There are other modes of therapy, but again, the mortality rates have been quite high even with surgery when they have been taken up on an emergency basis. The role of newer anticoagulants, I'm really not aware, because anticoagulation here can be used only on a short-term basis, maybe 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. Just like the ANCA vasculitis here, thrombosis is a manifestation or a marker of disease activity alone. Once you send the disease into remission, definitely the vessels will recanalize, which we have seen with our personal experience, and you can stop the anticoagulation. With the newer anticoagulants, I really don't know. I have no experience with the newer oral anticoagulants.
Thank
Maybe
you.
in patients who are allergic to warfarin and acetron, again, the newer ones can be tried, yes.
Okay. Ashok Kumar wants to know what is the recommended treatment for Behçet's with DVT and pulmonary artery aneurysms?
So as I said just now, for DVT, yes, you have to give immunosuppressives, glucocorticoids, and ideally they advise cyclophosphamide as a very good drug. TNF inhibitors have been found to play a good role now, especially infliximab and adalimumab have come to stay in refractory cases. And anticoagulation on a short-term basis, by short-term, he means 6 months to 1 year till the thrombus resolves and the disease goes into remission. For pulmonary artery aneurysm, no anticoagulation, as I said. It may be associated with the thrombus, but endarterectomy should be the treatment of choice, that too as an endovascular procedure than an open procedure. And in refractory cases, it may bleed again, so hence they may have to resort even to lobectomy sometimes.
Yeah, Dr. Bhupendra wants to know the treatment for arthritis, acne, enthesitis group of Behçet's.
Yeah, treatment of acne is the same for other acne. That is what has been described in the EULAR guidelines. You can apply topical agents, and it really doesn't need aggressive treatment. But for only for oral ulcers, apremilast has been found to be good. For acne, the treatment is the same as for any other acne, as far as I'm, to my knowledge, and as far as I've read.
The last few questions. Dr. Yojana Gokhale wants to know, do you think it is important to rule out Crohn's before diagnosing the Behçet's disease, especially those with the GI features? I think it's
You are absolutely right, Dr. Jyotsna. That is why I put up that slide of Crohn's and Behçet together, because Crohn's mimics Behçet to a very great extent, and it's absolutely mandatory that we have to rule out Crohn's before we think of Behçet. But the only deciding factor on endoscopy findings is the beautiful volcano crater-like ulcer, and definitely the histopathology findings, which I didn't mention because of want of time. In Crohn's, you get a non-caseating granuloma, whereas here you get a perivascular infiltration, infiltrate suggestive of vasculitis. So it's quite easy. But again, as you said, yes.
Dr. Ved wants to know again, highlight the relationship of Behçet's and spondyloarthritis.
Sir, you want me to put the slides again?
No, I don't think so. You haven't mentioned actually how this question has come before you explained earlier. So maybe.
Okay. Sir, I would like to just add on some more points which I've noted. For instance, in patients who have who are B51 positive, oral, genital, ocular, skin, and pathogy are the ones that are usually associated with B51 positivity. And those that are negatively associated are the thrombophlebitis, CNS, and GI tract involvement, and the joint involvement.
Yep.
So These are some differentiating features in Behçet itself. But they are grouped under the MHC vanopathies and have described about the cytokines and the ERAP1 and the epistatic effect of B51 on B27. And there are a lot more factors which make them similar to each other.
Okay,
Enthesitis, which is a common pathogenesis at pressure points. For instance, the oral mucosa is a pressure point. The anterior chamber in the eye is a pressure point. The blood vessel lumen, again, the endothelium is a pressure point. So wherever there are areas of pressure points and are subjected to trauma, just like it behaves like an enthesitis, especially the ascending aorta and the other areas in the vasculature, they're all pressure points. That is why you get ascending aorta aneurysm both in AS as well as in Behçet.
Do we use TOFA in Behçet's, and then whether it is a concern on the DVT? Tofacitinib in Behçet.
I have no personal experience. It's a 2020 article. Maybe in lower doses, I think we can try it and just take precautions. And we can use it along with steroids. Maybe I really don't know. I have no personal experience.
Yeah, it's off-label use. Yeah.
I would be happy if anybody could enlighten me on that.
Sure.
But just because DVT is one of the complications of tofacitinib, I wouldn't stay away when it's good enough for all the other manifestations. I would boldly start with tofacitinib, and I would start anticoagulants if necessary.
No, but it's off-label. It's not mentioned actually.
Yeah.
Then what do we know about incomplete Behçet's by Dr. Soumya? And how long can we give colchicine by Dr. Apurva?
Okay. This was one thing. My talk was only on updates in Behçet. Yeah. Hence, I could not talk about the incomplete Behçet, which we have seen during our student days, especially at Madras Medical College, under the leadership of Professor C.P. Rajendran and Potkudi Madam, who worked together. We have seen and we have published a paper. Dr. Arul Raja was a PG, and he took up the Behçet cases, and we together have published a paper about 12 to 15 cases of Behçet, which did not show all the manifestations of Behçet. You need not have all at the same point of time. For example, in an Indian population, you really don't get to see a lot of CNS. We do get CNS manifestations, but we've ignored the total intestinal component. And at Ramchandra, I've been seeing quite a lot of ocular Behçet. So the manifestations vary. You can get only one manifestation of Behçet, maybe only a vascular, arterial, or venous. Then it's called as an incomplete Behçet. But you have to know everything about Behçet, and whenever you get that particular system manifestation, you have to keep Behçet in mind and work up for Behçet also.
Thank you.
And the second one, what was it? Colchicine. Colchicine has been a wonderful drug for oral and genital ulcers, and you can use it as long as the patient is symptomatic, and once the patient becomes asymptomatic, we can stop it, because they can remain asymptomatic for quite a period of time, and maybe 6 months, 1 year, and it depends, it's individualized. And once the patient becomes and taking into account the blood counts also when we give colchicine, and the renal functions, as usual, all the precautions, and we can taper the dose, we can stop it, it's individualized. You can stop it when they become asymptomatic, and when they become symptomatic again and taking all the precautions, we can restart it again. It's a good drug.
Yeah. A few questions, I think there are repeats. You might have already mentioned about the erythema nodosum uveitis can be a part of Crohn's or Behçet's. Any difference in frequency, and then what is the treatment presentation of the chronic Behçet's disease? You already mentioned, I suppose.
Yes, I've already mentioned. Yeah. Neuro Behçet needs aggressive treatment. Yeah. We cannot take it lightly, just like the eye.
Last question before I go to Dr. Aman. What is the most common presentation in pediatric Behçet's, ma'am? And then what is the cause of death in Behçet's?
Pediatric Behçet, we've seen only a couple of cases, very few cases. I'm not a pediatric rheumatologist. They would be able to give a better answer to this. But when I was a student, I have seen one patient, I even remember his name, Judson, who was admitted in the special ward. He presented only as a meningitis and a sacroiliitis. And somehow we did the workup for Behçet, and it turned out to be, he turned out to be B51 positive. I still remember him very well. And those days we had only steroids because it was like an aseptic meningitis. That was one manifestation which I've seen in pediatric Behçet. And what is the other one, sir? The other question you asked? Death, common cause of death, again, aneurysms. aneurysms, perforations, untreated Behçet, and cardiac involvement when it's aggressive, especially rupture of a pulmonary artery aneurysm or an ascending aorta aneurysm, or the intestinal ones. Intestinal aneurysms can occur in the jejunum. Hence, we have to be very, very careful. And we should do all the investigations and treat them immediately with steroids and immunosuppressives before we proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Rajeshwari. Now we became experts in Behçets. Thank you.
I don't know, sir. I had a nightmare preparing this. It was a
very
very
nice.
tough topic. Thank you so much. As long as all of you are happy, I am also happy. Thank you for chairing and the wonderful questions you made me answer in your own nice way. And thank you, audience, for your kind participation and listening instead of running away. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you, organizers, once again.
So may I introduce Dr. Aman Sharma. Professor Aman Sharma, please. Professor Aman Sharma is giving a talk on ANCA-associated vasculitis, management, trial update, and steroid-free regimens. Dr. Sharma, all of you know, I mean, I really need not have to spend much time explaining to him. He had several books, chapters, many papers, uncounted. He's a professor and head of clinical immunology and rheumatology, internal medicine, PG MER Chandigarh, and he's also secretary-elect Indian Rheumatology Association. I think he will take over from this year end. Professor Aman Sharma, please.
Thank you, sir. At the outset, I would like to thank you for your very generous introduction, and I'll also like to thank President Sir Dr. Alakendu Ghosh and my dear friend Sapan and Dr. Shenoy for asking me to speak about something which I love. So the brief that has been given to me is to talk about the trials in ANCA vasculitis, and also to talk about steroid-free regimens. So without much ado, we all know about the landmark Anthony Fauci publication in 1971, which brought cyclophosphamide into the picture in this NEJM publication. And what was a universally fatal disease became a chronically manageable disease, if I could say so. But there were issues with this, and we are all aware that with cyclophosphamide, with this use, the survival did improve, as I've already told you, and it has been improving over a period of time. But there were concerns of infertility in young, and the major issue was the risk of malignancy in the patients which were exposed to cyclophosphamide. So initially, the induction was continued to be on with cyclophosphamide, but this Cycaziram trial published by David Jane's group showed that azathioprine, once the induction was done with cyclophosphamide, azathioprine was as good as cyclophosphamide in maintenance. And with this paper, we know that azathioprine became a standard of care as far as remission, as far as the maintenance of ANCA-associated vasculitis was concerned. Then, as a few years later, a study showed that methotrexate was as good as azathioprine. This was a WGNT trial, which showed that methotrexate was as good as azathioprine as far as the maintenance was concerned. And further efforts to decrease the dose of cyclophosphamide, because we are all aware that initially oral cyclophosphamide was used in the doses of around 2 milligrams per kg body weight, which was quite a high dose. So it was shown that IV pulse cyclophosphamide, which had a lower total cumulative dose, was as good as oral cyclophosphamide. And this trial showed that pulse would be better probably than oral cyclophosphamide. Although the relapses with the IV pulse cyclophosphamide were a shade higher, but they were non-life threatening relapses and did not really change the outcome of these patients. Then in 2010 came the landmark studies, the RAVE and Rituximab trials, back-to-back studies published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which were very exciting studies, which showed that rituximab works in these patients. and works very well. And we had one more potent agent in along with cyclophosphamide as far as induction of remission was concerned. But we have to understand that RAVE met the non-inferiority criteria, but they did not meet the superiority criteria. So many times people go back with an idea that probably rituximab was shown to be superior. So was not the case. In fact, it met the non-inferiority criteria and did not really meet the superiority criteria. We also have to remember that in RAVE, the severe disease like alveolar hemorrhage requiring ventilatory support and renal failure with serum creatinine of more than 4 milligrams, these patients were excluded. But those who had remission induction, they continued to be in remission after even after a longer duration. And this paper, the follow-up paper, was also published in New England Journal of Medicine. So you can understand the importance of these studies. It was also shown that the patients who had PR3 positive disease had higher relapses as compared to the ones who had MPO positive disease. Then in the maintenance, it was shown the people, although we know that some groups have a very good experience with MMF, but there was an improved trial which showed that MMF was inferior to azathioprine as in the remission maintenance of ANCA-associated vasculitis. The other game changer, this was from the French vasculitis group, the Louis Guivans group, was this Manretsan trial, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2014, around the time when we had IRACON at Chandigarh. This was a game changer in a way that rituximab 500 milligrams, 2 infusions in the beginning, followed by 500 milligrams every 6 months, was shown to be superior or better than azathioprine as far as relapses were concerned. And but in the same issue of this, there was an editorial by David Jane wherein he had written that is relapse a valid outcome for trials in vasculitis, just like what we had in the Cyclops trial, and there may not be direct association between relapse and death. So the long-term outcomes were published later on, which showed that there was an advantage as far as the major relapse-free survival was concerned. This is a 5 years data of the same study. And so many people believe that with this advantage, probably rituximab is positioning itself as the agent of choice as far as remission maintenance in ANCA-associated vasculitis is concerned. Although the flip side, some people believe that azathioprine in these patients in the maintenance phase was used at a lower dose, so it may not have been truly represented. But still, the curves were so widely apart and the difference was so huge that probably we will have to accept that rituximab is better choice as far as remission induction agent in ANCA-associated vasculitis is concerned. Following this was the other trial, which was Manretsan 2, wherein the French group tried, wherein in one group they gave fixed schedule rituximab infusions every 6 months, and in the individually tailored group, they gave rituximab only if there was repopulation of B cells by measuring the CD19 levels, or if there was doubling of the PR3 level. So if either the ANCAs increased, or if there was a repopulation of B cells, and they showed that there was no change, no difference at 28 months of follow-up. But they also showed that the ones in the planned arm had much lower rituximab infusions as compared to the group which received scheduled 6-monthly rituximab. But one thing which is very important for all of us to understand, that relapses were seen even in the absence of circulating B cells, even when the CD19 levels were 0, and even in those patients where the PR3 levels did not go up in these patients. So we asked this question because when they calculated the sample size for Manretsan 2, they had taken into account that there would be arbitrary risk of relapse of 35% in the control group, whereas in reality, in the Manitsan main trial, the major relapses were only 5% and the minor relapses were only 11%. So if this real life picture was taken, the sample size actually would have been much bigger than what was eventually published in the Manitsan 2 trial. So, and the follow-up also, we properly presumed that over a long-term follow-up, although the results in the initial part were not statistically significant, but if there was a long-term follow-up, these could have become significant. So the Louis Gibbons reply was that they did not have the, when they planned the Manitsan 2 trial, they did not have the results of main Manitsan trial. So it was of a presumptive nature as far as the risk of relapse was concerned. So they accepted that their study was underpowered to detect an absolute relapse rate difference of 7%. And they also accepted that these differences might have become statistically significant had the sample size been larger or if there was a longer follow-up. So, and in our personal experience also, we've tried this in a few patients where we tried to tailor the maintenance in patients based upon Manitsan 2, and in some of those we had relapses, and we eventually had to go back to the scheduled rituximab doses and not continue any further with the Manitsan 2 regime. So the other trial, which was published in 2019, was so we've talked about mycophenolate mofetil. Mycophenolate mofetil as a remission injection agent vis-a-vis cyclophosphamide in ANCA vasculitis. So if you look at the main paper, it shows very beautifully that the time to primary remission, there was no difference, and then time to first relapse also, if the total numbers are clubbed together. But if you dig out the supplementary, then you see that there were more relapses in PR3 ANCA positive patients. And also the relapse-free survival was shorter in the MMF group as compared to the cyclophosphamide group. And it was only proposed that probably MMF might be used in the patients who have milder MPO positive disease and may not be a good choice for PR3 positive frequently relapsing disease. So another drug, another study, which was a maintenance trial again, was efficacy and safety of belimumab in combination with azathioprine for maintaining remission. And a combination did not show any improvement with the azathioprine vis-a-vis the azathioprine alone. So this study shows that there is no benefit of adding belimumab to azathioprine as far as maintenance is concerned. The other important trial, which has been published last year and which was awaited for a long period of time, was PEXIVAS study. So this looked at the role of PLEX in ANCA-associated vasculitis. I've not really put the MEPEX trial because of the paucity of time and couple of other trials because of the time constraints. But we are all aware that the earlier MEPEX trial had shown that although there was no mortality benefit with PLEX in advanced ANCA vasculitis, but probably the dialysis dependence improved in patients who were given plasma exchange. This study, which published in the New England Journal of Medicine, tried two things. One, the role of PLEX in ANCA vasculitis, and two, they looked at the standard steroid dose and also looked at the reduced dose. This probably also brings into the context our other question that which has been posed to me as far as steroid-free regimens are concerned. So all the patients received pulse 1 to 3 grams in the beginning, and then one group had a standard steroid taper and the other group had a reduced steroid taper. And if you look at these curves, the primary outcome as far as death or ESRD is concerned was no different with whether you use or you don't use plasma exchange, and also was no difference with whether you use reduced dose of corticosteroids or you use the standard dose of corticosteroids, meaning by which that we could get away with using smaller doses of steroids, and we may not have to give higher doses of corticosteroids. So the other drug which has been trying to make its position instead of corticosteroids in management of ANCA vasculitis is C5a inhibitor, which is Avacopan. There were 2 phase 2 trials which showed benefit of Avacopan in management of ANCA vasculitis, especially as probably a steroid sparing agent. And then there was a phase 3 trial, which was Advocate trial, in which in the one arm there was a Avacopan was used in Avacopan was used 30 milligrams twice daily, whereas the other was there was a placebo prednisolone taper, and the standard of care had placebo twice daily as like Avacopan. Sorry for this typo, and prednisolone tapered to 0 over 21 weeks. If you see here, at week 52 remission, there was superiority with C5a inhibitor as compared to the standard glucocorticoids, and of the glucocorticoid toxicity index, which takes into account various side effects in different systems. Also, there was superiority with the C5a inhibitor. So probably this has a lot of promise. And if you see this again here, there was a relapse. There was an advantage with the C5a inhibitor, Avacopan, and even the renal functions continued to improve. As if you can see the change in the EGFR, the improvement in the EGFR with C5a inhibitor. So based upon this, the ChemoCentryx company, which would be marketing Avacopan, announced the FDA acceptance of Avacopan new drug application for the treatment of ANCA vasculitis, and the next, I think somewhere in the next middle of the next year, you might hear more about in the middle of this year, we might hear more about the FDA approval of this drug. Now coming on to the next big study, which was MENDERSAN-3 trial, which was published in Annals of Internal Medicine last year. If you just to put the things in context, these were the MENDERSAN-2 trial patients, starting off from the main those who were in remission at month 28 from MENDERSAN-2, they were scheduled to either receive 6 monthly rituximab or were scheduled to receive a placebo infusion. And if you see that there was a relapse-free survival, and both major relapse-free survival were higher in the patients who were given rituximab as compared to those with placebo. And there are a few questions which we need to ask, and we wrote a letter that 9.5, putting things in context again, 9.5% of the initially 157 patients were excluded due to the relapse within the first 28 months of MENDERSAN-2, which is again not a small number. And despite inclusion of patients who did not have a relapse in that time, 2 in the rituximab arm and 12 in the placebo arm relapsed. So if you put the data of MENDERSAN-2 and MENDERSAN-3 together, there is a high risk of relapse over 56 months period, which increases significantly after treatment discontinuation. So this and 60 months relapse data from the main MENDERSAN trial reaffirms that we need prolonged, if not lifelong, maintenance therapy. So as of now, the drug-free remission seems to be a distant reality. And in response, the Louis Givens group replied that they agreed with most of our comments. And although in general, the outcomes in the ANCA vasculitis were better, but the results do suggest that that we should consider ANCA vasculitis, especially PR3 positive, with those with PR3 positive disease, should be managed as a chronic disease and may warrant a long-term therapy with rituximab for 4 years or more. So that's what, in my previous talks, I've talked about what the Gary Hoffman has said, that probably if it is not contraindicated and the therapy is tolerated, he'll probably treat his patients for a long time or maybe indefinitely. So this is putting things in context, because all trials have a finite period, but we have to treat patients in real life. Sometimes you have to gather the information from the trials and also put your personal experience of how this disease behaves. And I can tell you, after having treated almost 350 patients, that the drug-free remission is possible, but in a very small subset of patients. So last, towards the end of the trials component of the talk, the other important paper which was published in ARD was the Rituximab trial, it has 3 phases. It's more clearer here: induction phase, remission maintenance phase, and a follow-up phase. In the remission induction phase, they had used glucocorticoids along with. I would wish to draw your attention that rituximab, the David James group, has been using 1 gram in the past, and in this trial also, 1 gram every 4 months was used here in one group, and azathioprine 2 milligram per kg body weight per day was used in the other arm, and it was shown. And this study, the standard dose corticosteroid vis-a-vis the low dose corticosteroids were also used. The out of the 3 phases that we've discussed, the first induction phase results were published in ARD, and if you can see here that the outcomes with the management were very nice, were very good as far as in the induction phase where rituximab was concerned. So I would wish to clarify that induction in this group was with rituximab, and maintenance was with 2 arms, either with rituximab or with azathioprine arm. And the data on the maintenance phase was presented at the ERA EDTA conference, and I've taken these slides from the Twitter, which are from the Twitter, are in public domain. These are not yet published as far as my knowledge goes. And you can see that rituximab there was a statistically significant difference with the use of rituximab in maintenance as compared to azathioprine. So this also, hammers home the point which was proven earlier by the MERIT-SAND trial. However, they have used a much higher dose of rituximab, and at a more frequent at 4 months as compared to the 6 months in the MERIT-SAND trial. And if you see that the total, as far as relapses, we know these are the numbers, major and minor relapses. There were differences, and the adverse events also. If you see, I think the rituximab is doing fairly well, and there's not much severe hypogammaglobulinemia also, which always is a concern when we use rituximab over a period of time. So the other question which is always asked is, for how long do we treat corticosteroids? And this was a meta-analysis of various trials published till 2010, and it shows that the ones in the non-zero glucocorticoid group had 14% relapses, and those with zero glucocorticoid target doses has much higher relapses. And if you bring your knowledge from RAVE trial also, where they tried to stop steroids at 6 months, the relapse rate was pretty higher, and some people believe that it was because of stopping steroids at 6 months. So with this background, there was a study published in Rheumatology Oxford talking about a steroid-free regimen. There were 2 groups of patients. One was the Alan Salama's group from Imperial College, and the other one was Mark Little's group from Dublin. This had used methylprednisolone in some doses. There was some difference in these 2 groups, and then they compared the outcomes of these 2 groups with the historical cohorts, matched patients from the historical cohorts of various UVAS trials. They were tending to give in the group 1 steroids till 7 days, and in group 2 steroids till 2 weeks. And it was shown that the cumulative dose in these patients, 49 patients, were lower, and the cumulative cyclophosphamide dose was also lower. These patients they were given both rituximab and cyclophosphamide also. In the paper which was published from this group, which I didn't include because of paucity of time, where they had used rituximab 1 gram 2 weeks apart, and also 10 milligram per kg body weight cyclophosphamide. There were less exposure to corticosteroids and cyclophosphamide. So, but we and our friends from SGPJ asked that whether this is an overestimation or the patients in their cohort had a milder disease. So, well, they didn't agree to some of these comments, but they did agree that widespread acceptance of their regime is not indicated on the basis of these data alone. And this protocol should be tested in an RCT setting of AAV patients with a standard glucocorticoid regimen, because it's, this was not one of the best designs if you are taking such an important decision in a disease which kills and kills fast. So the other thing which is important for us to know is that we use biologicals, this was our experience where we used a biosimilar rituximab in 77 patients. And I just wish to tell you that whether it was remission induction, if you look at the remission rates or relapses or even severe infections or even mortality, they were not greatly different. And even difference between primary induction and reinduction with the relapse, there were no differences. And even in the maintenance phase, there was not much differences. And I think what it goes on to show, these are the severe infections that we've had. The most common were pneumonias. And then we did have couple of patients with pyomyositis and meningoencephalitis, and one had reactivation of pulmonary tuberculosis. So these were the severe infections that we saw. So with this, I would wish to conclude that ANCA vasculitis treatment outcomes are improving, and efforts towards tailored maintenance regimes are being undertaken. But I think I personally believe, looking at the data and with the question that we pose, we've not reached a stage where we can start to take therapeutic decisions based upon things like Matrix-M 2. Rituximab is definitely emerging as the agent of choice for remission maintenance. And that's what I believe personally. Moving towards lesser doses of corticosteroids, I'm not really very certain to say whether we've reached a stage where no steroids can be used, unless we have a C5a inhibitor being used in real life clinical practice, which comes and replaces corticosteroids. With this, I would wish to share, I would pay tribute to Paul Bacon. And we were unfortunately not having Dr. Louis here this evening, and also David Jane and Wolfgang Gross. This is the picture taken by my nephrology friend at time of IRECON 2014. And I think with this, I would thank all of you, and I'll be happy to take questions if there are any.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Aman. It's absolutely a senior consultant and very very well known person. As so you gave such a vivid display of the trial updates and such that bar diagram with the chronological order where we have come all the way to the combination, induction, and maintenance therapy. So I would like to there are several questions for you. May I go ahead with that?
Yes, sir, please.
Dr. Arvind, he wants to have to know the role of cyclosporin in induction therapy.
Well, I'm not aware about too many randomized trials as far as cyclosporin concerned. There are anecdotal case reports, and even some by our own colleagues from nephrology in PGI who have more experience with cyclosporin. But I personally am not aware about any large samples, any studies which support the use of cyclosporin.
Dr. Soumya wants to know the actual indications for the use of Septran in GPA.
Well, I think it must be used in all patients who are exposed to cyclophosphamide, and I also use it for. It should also probably be used for patients on rituximab also. Although the previous notion that staph has a role to play in the relapses, and this takes care of the nasal colonizers in staph, and people have started, tried the Bactroban in application in the noses. That has not really been proven, but I would give it to prevent PCP. Which is an imminent threat, and it should be given in all patients who, at least in the induction, during the induction time.
Dr. Yojana wants to know: do you believe that Plexivas included mild cases to comment on effect of Plex in preventing ESRD?
No, ma'am. The patients had a severe disease also, and I think. There was a lot of debate, and people have waited to. This study was presented, I think, almost 2 years ago, and did not get published. People were going into the subgroup analysis and various other things. It was presented simultaneously, first in the ISN meeting, and then also in the rheumatology meetings. But I think a lot of debate has gone into it, and I believe we'll have to just accept that as of now, with this evidence, we don't really. Only thing that we can say is we can't really support the use of Plex, number one. Number two, it was such a study was well done over a long period of time, recruiting with a large sample size. It may not be practically possible to do this kind of study once again also. And unfortunately, although there might have been some case in some special scenarios, we are unlikely to get the evidence in the near future because of the complexities involved in doing the study.
Dr. Shanmuganandan wants to know, is Avocapan is in pipeline in India?
Many people ask me this question. I don't think we know that answer. They've applied for US FDA approval and did put that slide. Probably July is the date when it will be heard and they will deposit those fees and probably we'll get to hear at that time. Maybe I'm not aware whether the Chemocentrics has applied for permission from our DCGI, but probably they'll do it after it has been approved by FDA or other European bodies.
Dr. Apurva wants to know, rituximab alone is enough for maintenance, or rituximab plus azathioprine, or just azathioprine?
Excellent question. In some, it may be enough. You have to have that pulse of the patient. In some, it may be enough. In others, there is a data from Cleveland Clinic, Gary Hoffman, which in retrospective analysis, they showed that when a drug is added to rituximab, as compared to rituximab alone, the relapse rates are lesser. But probably as of now, then you might be combining these drugs in every patient. What I'll do is probably I'll give only what I do. I give only rituximab in the beginning. But if I have relapses, then I either increase the dose of 500 milligrams to 1 gram every 4 months, or add another drug at the slightest hint of a relapse on maintenance.
Yojana is another query. Subgroup analysis in PEXIVAS did show benefit in preventing ESRD, and it was given in patients with creatinine more than 3.4. I think you have already mentioned about that.
Yeah, there are some people who still believe that there might be a role, but I think a lot of debate has also occurred, and they just waited if they could bring out there are some people who believe it, but I think the probably jury is still out. We don't really, we'll have to have more opinion on that, whether there is any role or not. As of now, probably we don't have enough evidence.
Yes. Lalit wants to know, which is a small percentage of patients of ANCA-associated vasculitis where you decide to stop treatment?
What I do, I'll give maintenance for a few years, and then I start taper the treatment, and you get to look at all the hardcore pointers like the creatinine, the active sediments in the urine, and you look at the soft things like whether the patient has had nasal crusting, patient has had some oral ulcerations. If they haven't had any, then I would probably stop after maybe few years, maybe 5 years, some patients. And then I can tell you, I have patients who were initially on Dr. Bhambri's follow-up, and we have a total follow-up of around 25 years. And some of those patients had relapsed after 15 years. So that will occur. So you have to keep these patients on a long follow-up. And even if they've been off therapy, one patient was a pituitary involvement with diabetes insipidus kind of presentation, was off therapy for more than a decade, and then relapsed, had a lung relapse and sinonasal relapse.
Yeah, so that means you should have a masterly observation.
Absolutely.
Prashant wants to know, should we need to monitor IG levels in patients on long-term rituximab?
You must do it even before giving the first infusion, and also before every rituximab infusion. And although there are some guidelines for managing hypogammaglobulinemia, I think this was presented by my friend Chetan Mukhtiar at the vasculitis conference that we've had, and it has been published in Rheumatology Oxford. They are in detail, you can refer to that paper. But the dictum is that if you have recurrent infections and the serum IgG levels are less than 3, then you should probably give IVIG before giving rituximab.
Yeah, that's answers another query from Prashant. The Yojana again wants, it's a big question. May I study that? May I read?
Yes, I'll read that, sir. I'll read myself and probably. More frequently too, because of the enrolled relapse. I don't think we can compare these two. And when this rituximab was presented, there was a debate, and the Twitter also. Those who are active, they will know that a lot of questions were asked, and people asked that if you can get away with 500 milligrams every 6 months, then why should? And the outcomes are reasonably well, even in those groups. Why should you use 1 gram every 4 monthly? And if you are looking at other studies also, now people have used various different types of maintenance regimes. And if you look at the La Presse Medical issue of 2013, after the ANCA vasculitis meeting, there is a long table where different groups have used different doses. I don't think we have the final answer, but probably what I'll do is I'll give a lower dose of 500 milligrams every 6 months. And if if the patient has relapses, and I can tell you after our experience of our own experience, only few patients have required, if I remember offhand, I think only 3 or 4 patients are on 1 gram every 4 months. Rest are doing fine with rituximab every 6 months.
Yeah, Shanmugananda, I think the question has been answered. The Septron DS for PCP prophylaxis be helpful in preventing the GPA flare. Oh, not only infection, maybe the prevention of the GPA flare.
Well, that did initially it came with that. If I could tell some story, it came into ANCA treatment probably by serendipity. I heard that story that these patients had urinary tract infections, and for urinary tract infection they were given Septron. That was in late 70s or early 80s, and then they realized that those who were given Septron for urinary tract infections, the relapses decreased. And then was the hypothesis was that some people had shown staph colonization as a risk factor, but for the major systemic disease in the subsequent, if I remember offhand, it didn't really hold true for preventing the relapses in the major disease. Maybe some people thought that localized disease it may have benefit, but definitely not as far as the severe systemic disease was concerned. But for sure you will use it for prevention of PCP.
Yeah, that mentioned already. So another question was, do we need ANCA IF at all? If you use anti-PRT and MPO only?
Yes, absolutely right, sir. Shanmugh sir, you are spot on. As of now, the dictum is that you do a PR3 or MPO, and if you have strong suspicion and it is negative, you do again PR3 or MPO, with a different kit preferably. And if it is still negative, and you believe that there is a strong suspicion, you should send ANCA to a specialized lab, maybe somebody who is well adept at doing immunofluorescence, because I did discuss this at Shinoy's meeting in Kochi. At that time, presented that paper published in Annals of Rheumatic Diseases, wherein it was shown that all the commercially available assays have sensitivity of up and above 90%, all I think 7 or 8 assays, whereas ANCA, both by two different methods, had a sensitivity somewhere between 70 to 80%. So the commercial assays have a much higher sensitivity as compared to the immunofluorescence. So the answer is yes.
Dr. Amit wants preferred agent for induction, rituximab versus cyclophosphamide.
Well, I use cyclophosphamide unless the patient is young, where the fertility is an issue, you can't. There are other contraindications, or there is a risk for in a relapsing disease where we'll use rituximab and not cyclophosphamide, because as I said, risk of hypogammaglobulinemia increases as you give more rituximab. So I want to save the 2 grams of rituximab for the maintenance phase, because then probably theoretically the risk. That's why I use cyclophosphamide.
That's correct. So how do we give steroids in uncontrolled diabetic patient with MPO, mononeuritis multiplex, and renal involvement?
You have to do that jugglery.
Yeah.
We have to give immunosuppression, switch the patient to insulin. That's not an uncommon situation. Monitor the insulin more. Maybe what you will do is you look at what kind of presentation is there, and then how much steroid you can get away with, and do a close monitoring of you should do a steroid tight control with the sugar control with insulin.
Yeah. Doctor, I think Kunal's question has been answered. Alia Anita, in a patient with a pulmonary and renal MPO ANCA, creatinine 1.3, gradually increasing, recent pulmonary flare requiring PP, do you still consider only rituximab pulses without azathioprine during maintenance?
Yes, because what we've seen is that this creatinine will gradually come back to normal. So in the patients where we use reinduction, I'll tell you that in the patients who had a stable creatinine of say around 2.3, 2.4 also, after having been induced with cyclophosphamide, when we the patient had a pulmonary relapse and we used rituximab. We saw that in some of those patients, and it was not one patient, a few of those patients, the creatinine, even which was hovering around 1.8, 1.9, 2.3, some of them it came back to normal. Although we will have to look at the histopathology and the burdens classification, but this practical experiences, even that stable creatinine came back to normal. So I would probably have a look before giving everybody another drug along with rituximab.
Yeah, Kunal wants to know, when would you suggest combination rituximab and cyclophosphamide?
Well, in our experience, it's, we've used it in a couple of patients. It's a relapsing disease, advanced disease, where you exhausted all other options. Patient is still relapsing. We've had 2 or 3 such patients. And out of those 3, 2 we lost. One because of infection, the other because of overwhelming disease. I'm not a great proponent of combination. And the same concerns have been raised by people in the social media also when that combination trial was published in, I think it was in Annals. But if you don't have any other option, patient is still relapsing, I will reserve it for that, not in most of the other patients.
The place of methotrexate and leflunomide in ANCA induction therapy, mild ANCA limited to GP.
Well, there is, if you look at the EULAR EDTA recommendations, hardly any. It says that sinus disease without any bone involvement, skin disease without any ulceration, lung nodules which have not cavitated. So I think maybe if you've treated 200, you might have 1 or 2 patients like that. So just take it out of your box. You're not, in most of the other patients, you won't really be able to use it.
Indrajit Agarwal wants to know, any data for Jacinips in maintenance?
Not that I am aware.
Any new drug as an anti-B cell therapy by Ved?
Yes, yes. There was one another drug which is olemtuzumab, which has been used in I think 8 or 9 patients, but that's also again few small case series, not a trial.
What is the role of methotrexate in induction? I think it's already answered.
Yeah, one thing I would wish to say that when we talk about evidence-based medicine, the NORAM trial came with a lot of bang. Since people are asking about methotrexate. In the NORAM trial, it was shown that those who had non-renal, relatively milder disease, you could get away giving methotrexate as an induction at 1 year as compared to cyclophosphamide. But when the 5-year long-term data was published, it was shown that that those which were given in the methotrexate arm ended up receiving more steroids and ended up receiving more cyclophosphamide. So methotrexate was shown that, and this discussion I had with David Jain also during Dr. Danda's conference in Vellore in 2011, and he also believed in the same, that probably it's not a very good drug for remission induction.
Dr. Nikhil, any trials on combination induction agents like cyclo plus rituximab versus cyclo or rituximab only, especially with
I did tell you. Yeah, I did tell you that it is a Hammersmith group, the UK group, which has published it. And they used this combination. They've been using it, and they compared it with the historical cohorts. And they used a dose of 10 milligram per kg body weight cyclophosphamide instead of 15 milligrams.
Yeah. Dr. Anshu Goyal, in AAV in remission by cyclophosphamide or rituximab, after what time antibiotic prophylaxis to be stopped?
Ceftriaxone prophylaxis, maybe when you stop rituximab, when you stop cyclophosphamide. Rituximab, I generally tend to continue.
So from Pradeep Rajapati, up to how many months oral steroids to continue on remission induction with the Pulse MP and rituximab? And
I think the dictum is to reach a dose of around 7.5 to 10 milligrams at 3 months, and then reach 5 milligrams at 6 months. And probably I continued for a year and a half. And this is what most of the other people believe. And I showed that meta-analysis where when the people have stopped steroid at 6 months, there are a lot of relapses. So probably 5 milligrams or lesser, maybe 2.5 milligrams also for at least a year and a half.
So I think it would be the last question. You must be looking at them. Some are repeat, and some Dr. Manish is all the prizes to you for the good speech. From Tagore Nagar, what dose of cyclophosphamide infusion do you use for induction? I think you have mentioned that.
Yes, 15 milligram per kg. We use the UVAS regime, 15 milligram per kg body weight, unless there is a renal failure for which you have to modify, or the elderly patient. There is a study from the French group in elderly patients more than 65 years. You can give just 6 pulses of 500 milligrams.
Thank you, Aman. In fact, by narrating the questions, I'm exhausted. You are great.
Thank you very much, sir. It's been a pleasure.
Great job. Really. I'm handing. I think it's went on very well. I'm giving to the organizer, Dr. Padmanabh Shenoy. Over to you, please.
At the outset, let me thank everyone, especially all the speakers, Rajeshwari ma'am, Dr. Mahapatra and Aman sir. Masterly classes, it's very well received by everyone. You can know from the questions which has been asked. So if you listen to question answer session, you can manage most of the recent literature you can cover. So excellent. And what I find is in virtual platform, youngsters are asking questions which are very, very relevant. And I think that is a welcome step. In conferences, they may not stand up and ask, but in virtual platforms, they're asking questions. I think Indian rheumatology is bright in the youngsters' hand who are trainees are asking a lot of questions. Excellent. Thank you for the participation. And happy Republic Day to all of you. And I would like to thank the audiovisual team and also both the chairperson, URK Rao sir, and John Matthew could not attend today. URK Rao sir did a fantastic job. So many questions he asked. A lot of chairpersons sometimes struggle looking at the question, answer, and chat. But wonderful, sir. You are so tech savvy. Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and excellent conduct of this thing. And I would like to thank the sponsors of today's meeting also. And happy Republic Day to all of you. Let us make India great again. I am sure with all this and the COVID is ending soon, very soon we will have a physical meeting. But next month also, February also, we will have another meeting on osteoarthritis and gout. Hope to see you all. Thank you.